Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere you've never been, unless you've got a time machine and a strong stomach for giant insects. You're standing in the middle of what will one day be Patagonia, but right now it's the Late Cretaceous, about 80 million years ago. The air is thick and warm, heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting plants. A mist clings low over a plain broken by sparse clusters of conifers and ferns. Somewhere out there, barely visible in the haze, is the star of tonight's journey, Abelisaurus. Now, I'll be honest, star might be too strong a word. This isn't a fire-breathing dragon, and it's not about to save the day in some dinosaur action film. In fact, you might catch it standing completely still for minutes at a time, staring into nothing, like it's waiting for its brain to buffer. You probably won't survive this era if you're human, but Abelisaurus will, by doing almost nothing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward through the damp grass, each step sinking slightly into the mud. The cicada-like calls of ancient insects rasp through the mist. Somewhere overhead, a pterosaur glides soundlessly, its shadow briefly flickering over your face before disappearing. The ground is scattered with unfamiliar footprints, some small and bird-like, others huge, rounded impressions from a sauropod that must have passed hours ago. But the ones you're here for, they're oddly spaced, almost lazy. Abelisaurus doesn't seem to be in a hurry anywhere. A branch creaks nearby. Through the fog, you glimpse movement, a mottled shape, sandy beige against the green-brown undergrowth. The Abelisaurus is about 25 feet long, its bulk surprisingly lean for a predator, its short arms tucked awkwardly against its sides like someone who never learned what pockets are for. The skull is long and narrow, and you can see a faint ridge along the top, giving it an almost regal, but slightly goofy, profile. It takes a step, then another. The motion is deliberate, careful. It doesn't stalk, it just moves like it's ambling to the world's slowest lunch buffet. You realize that in the vast catalog of dinosaur behavior, this might be one of the least cinematic moments possible. And yet, there's something hypnotic about it. Mainstream paleontology tells us that Abelisaurus was discovered in Argentina in the mid-1980s, based on a single incomplete skull. That's right, one skull, and scientists have been guessing the rest ever since. Historians still argue whether it was a top predator in its region or more of a scavenger, picking off easy meals and leftovers from bigger, meaner neighbors. The evidence is so thin that you could write the whole biography of this dinosaur on the back of a receipt. A dragonfly the size of your hand hovers by your ear. You swat it away gently and keep walking, careful not to make sudden movements. The Abelisaurus lifts its head slightly, nostrils flaring as though catching your scent, or maybe the scent of something else entirely. And here's a quirky fact for you. Some fringe theories have suggested that Abelisaurus might have had feather-like coverings in certain life stages, though there's no direct fossil evidence. Imagine this same lethargic dinosaur wearing a half-hearted coat of fluff like it lost a bet. It sniffs again, then resumes its slow wander. The sound of its padded feet pressing into the mud is muffled, almost soothing. A small herd of plant-eating ornithopods crosses in the distance, heads down, grazing. The predator doesn't move toward them. You can't tell if it's full, bored, or just unwilling to commit to the energy expenditure. You pause to watch the mist swirl around its legs. The whole scene feels like it's stuck in slow motion. Every sound slightly muted, every movement unhurried. You get the sense that if you were to follow this animal all day, you might never see it break into a run. It lives in a dangerous time and place, yet it acts like nothing out there is urgent. And so you follow it, deeper into the fog, your breath sinking with the lazy rhythm of its gait. There are no roaring battles, no frantic chases, just a big, ancient creature existing in its own quiet way. The insects keep humming. The mist doesn't lift. Somewhere, far off, a deeper rumble echoes, maybe a distant storm, maybe the call of something larger. But here, with Abelisaurus, the world feels oddly still. You keep pace with the Abelisaurus, though pace might be too generous a word. It's more like you're shadowing a large, prehistoric tourist who has nowhere specific to be. The mist is beginning to thin in patches, letting filtered sunlight spill across the undergrowth in pale, golden slants. Each beam catches the moisture in the air, giving the scene that soft, dreamlike quality usually reserved for nature documentaries and overpriced coffee commercials. The dinosaur's feet make a faint, sucking sound each time it lifts them from the damp earth. You notice how its toes splay slightly with each step, gripping the mud before releasing it again. This isn't a sprinting machine, it's built for steady plodding. You imagine it probably wouldn't win any prehistoric foot races, unless the competition consisted entirely of rocks. Ahead, the underbrush thickens. Ferns crowd in close, their fronds brushing against your legs. Somewhere in the shadows, a rustle betrays something small and quick, likely a lizard darting out of the way. The Abelisaurus doesn't react. No head tilt, no flick of the tail, just another deliberate step forward, as if it's following some invisible path you can't see. Historians still argue whether this animal hunted alone or in loose, uncoordinated groups. Some argue it was a solitary ambler, relying on patience and scavenging. Others imagine a couple of them lumbering side by side like giant, scaly mall walkers. But today, there's only this one. Silent, indifferent, and moving through the greenery with the casual determination of someone looking for a misplaced snack. You catch a whiff of something faint but sharp on the air, an earthy, metallic tang. It could be a carcass somewhere ahead, or it could just be the humid smell of the swampy ground under your boots. Fringe theories suggest that some predators in this family had an unusually strong sense of smell, possibly able to detect a dying animal from miles away. You look at Abelisaurus's nostrils, wide and dark, and wonder if that's what's pulling it forward. The path narrows as tree trunks close in, their bark furrowed and flaking in pale strips. Strange bird-like calls echo from above, though you know they're not birds at all. This is still millions of years before the sparrow in your backyard will ever exist. You glance upward, half expecting to see a small feathery creature peering down at you. Instead, you spot a branch trembling under the weight of something reptilian, perhaps an ancient relative of modern iguanas, basking in the filtered light. Your foot catches on a root, and you steady yourself. Abelisaurus glances back, or maybe it's just turning its head at random, but the amber glow in its eye briefly catches the light. You're struck by how little urgency there is in that gaze. No threat, no welcome, just an awareness, like a stone that happens to notice the tide. Here's a mainstream fact. The Abelisaurus belonged to the Abelisauridae family, which roamed South America, Africa, and India during the Cretaceous. Many of its cousins had even shorter arms, making the famously tiny-armed T-Rex look like a concert pianist by comparison. Yet, despite these peculiar proportions, they were apex predators in their environments. Though clearly not all apex predators are created equally. The dinosaur steps into a small clearing, the light fully breaking through here. You can see its hide more clearly now, a pale, sandy beige mottled with darker splotches, the sort of camouflage that blends into dry, open areas but isn't doing much good in this shaded spot. Its tail sways lazily from side to side, brushing the ground. The ferns around you release faint spores into the air, their powdery scent mixing with the damp earth. You realize something. You've been following this animal for at least an hour, and it hasn't done a single thing that would make a Cretaceous highlight reel. No roaring, no lunging, no chasing. Just walking. Somehow, though, you can't look away. There's a meditative quality to its movements, a rhythm that's starting to seep into you. The underbrush stirs again. Not from you, not from the Abelisaurus, but from something else just beyond sight. You pause, listening. The sound is soft, like dry leaves being dragged over stone. Abelisaurus pauses too. Its head tilts slightly, not much, just enough to suggest it noticed. For a moment, you think you might see some action. And then it goes back to walking. You can't help but smirk. This is a creature that lives in a dangerous, competitive ecosystem, and yet it meets potential encounters with the same energy you bring to answering emails on a Friday afternoon. As you move forward, the mist finally thins enough to reveal a glimpse of the open floodplain beyond. A shallow river glints in the distance, winding lazily through the landscape. Abelisaurus angles toward it, the sound of water faintly audible over the background hum of insects. You decide to keep following. After all, at this speed, you won't be losing it anytime soon. The air feels lighter now that you've stepped out of the thickest undergrowth, but the ground under your boots is softer, slick with a layer of silt carried in by the nearby river. Abelisaurus plods ahead, leaving clear three-toed impressions in the mud, each print about the size of a dinner plate. You match your steps between them for a moment, just to see how it feels. It's like trying on shoes 5 sizes too big, awkward, but a little satisfying. The river is closer than you thought. Its surface moves lazily, the current gentle enough to let mats of floating vegetation drift downstream without breaking apart. You'd expect any predator worth its teeth to approach water with a bit of caution, scanning for prey or threats. But Abelisaurus just steps right to the edge, lowers its head, and drinks. It does so slowly, like it has no reason to worry about ambushes. You crouch nearby, watching. The sunlight glints off the ripples made by its tongue, and for a moment, you catch your own reflection in the same water that's lapping against ancient mud. Something about that makes the distance between your time and this one feel smaller, as if you've slipped through a crack in history rather than leapt across millions of years. The peace is broken, not by Abelisaurus, but by a sudden splash upstream. You snap your head toward the sound, expecting maybe a fish or a small reptile. Instead, you see a small herd of hypsilophodonts, quick, bipedal herbivores, scrambling up the bank. Their movements are sharp, nervous, as though something just spooked them. Your heart rate picks up. You glance at Abelisaurus, ready for the lunge, the chase, the primal energy of predator and prey. But it just watches. Historians still argue whether Abelisaurus actively hunted such quick herbivores or if it left that job to speedier predators. Its anatomy suggests strong leg muscles, but not necessarily built for long chases. One quirky idea floating in paleontology circles is that some predators may have been opportunistic lungers, relying on short bursts of energy rather than drawn-out pursuit. Watching it now, you're not convinced even that's in the cards today. It flicks its tail once, a slow, heavy motion, then turns away from the herd entirely. The hypsilophodonts vanish into the ferns, their small footprints rapidly filling with water from the soft bank. Abelisaurus steps back from the river, shaking its head slightly as if dismissing the idea of a meal altogether. You trail it as it moves along the water's edge. A crocodilian shape surfaces briefly in the shallows, probably an early relative of the ones that will still be around in your own time, just scaled up a bit. It watches you both with the patience of something that knows sooner or later, prey will come close enough. Abelisaurus doesn't even acknowledge it. Here's your mainstream fact for the day. Unlike many other theropods, Abelisaurus had a relatively short, deep skull with strong jaw muscles, suggesting it could deliver a powerful bite. What it lacked in arm utility, it may have made up for in head and neck strength. Though, as you're seeing, that power isn't exactly on display at the moment. The two of you meander downstream, where the river widens into a series of shallow pools. The edges are lined with reeds and small cycads, their leaves making a dry whisper in the breeze. Dragonflies hover above the water like tiny helicopters, their wings catching the sunlight. You half expect Abelisaurus to snap at one just to break the monotony, but no, it seems content to simply exist here, letting time trickle by like the water underfoot. Another rustle comes from the opposite bank, heavier this time. Through a gap in the reeds, you see movement. A juvenile sauropod, alone, probably strayed from its group. Now this, you think, could be a moment. The thing's big enough to be a satisfying meal, slow enough to be catchable, and definitely not paying attention. Abelisaurus turns its head, eyes narrowing just slightly. It steps forward, water swirling around its feet. Your pulse quickens. This could be it, the big scene. It takes another step, then lowers its head, scoops a mouthful of water, and turns away again. You let out a quiet laugh. Of course, you murmur under your breath. This is not the kind of predator that burns calories unless it's absolutely necessary. Maybe it knows something you don't, like the rest of the sauropod herd being just out of sight, ready to trample any threat. Or maybe it's just lazy. By the time the sun climbs higher, the mist is gone and the sky is a clean, pale blue. You can see far down the river now, the floodplain stretching wide and open. Abelisaurus follows it with the steady rhythm of something that has done this 1,000 times before, unhurried, undistracted, and thoroughly unimpressed by the drama of its own era. You match your steps to its again. Somehow, you're starting to enjoy this. No chases, no battles, just the quiet companionship of a creature that knows how to move through the world without urgency. The floodplain opens into a vast, grassy expanse. Though, grass here isn't the kind you're used to. It's mostly low ferns, horsetails, and early flowering plants, all swaying under a light breeze. The sky is a washed-out blue, the kind that makes every shadow look softer. You squint across the open ground and notice movement. Small herds of different dinosaurs spread out like patches of color against the muted greens and browns. And here's the thing, they're all doing something. A group of hadrosaurs is bunched together, heads down, chewing methodically through clumps of vegetation. Farther off, a pair of young sauropods, still enormous by modern standards, are swinging their necks in lazy arcs, stripping leaves from trees. Even smaller predators in the distance are weaving through the plants, darting after whatever quick-footed meals they can find. Everything here feels busy, purposeful. Then there's Abelisaurus. It steps into the open like a guest who didn't get the memo about the dress code, looking neither hurried nor particularly engaged. Its head turns slightly from side to side, not in sharp, predatory scanning motions, but in slow arcs, like someone vaguely aware there might be something interesting out there if they just keep looking long enough. You can't help but notice how the other animals react. The hadrosaurs glance up briefly when it emerges from the brush, their chewing slowing for just a beat. The sauropods adjust their positions, making sure there's a tree or two between themselves and the newcomer. Even the smaller predators seem to skirt the area a little wider now. Mainstream fact: in its time, Abelisaurus would have been among the larger carnivores in South America. That size alone was enough to get it respect, or caution, from most herbivores. Historians still argue whether it actually earned that respect through frequent predatory success, or if it mostly survived on intimidation and scavenging. Watching it now, the intimidation factor seems to work just fine. As you walk alongside it, you catch a faint shimmer in the air ahead, heat rising off the open ground. The sun is climbing and the temperature with it. You wonder if this might finally stir Abelisaurus into more active behavior, maybe even push it toward hunting before the day gets too hot. Instead, it stops. Just stops, mid-stride, as though its internal decision-making process has concluded. Standing here is the best possible move right now. It plants itself in the open, tail swaying slightly, head tilted to catch whatever breeze there is. Off to the left, a small commotion starts. Two ornithopods chasing each other in a tight circle, their squeaky calls carrying over the plain. You think now this has to catch its attention. But Abelisaurus doesn't so much as glance in their direction. Here's your quirky tidbit for the section. Some researchers once floated the idea that Abelisaurus, like some modern big cats, might have preferred to hunt at night to avoid overheating. Of course, that's pure speculation, there's no direct evidence for it, and others argue its eyesight may not have been great in low light. Still, it could explain why this mid-morning scene is looking more like a low-energy picnic than an apex predator's feeding ground. A sharp cry cuts through the air from far off. A larger theropod, maybe a Mapusaurus, staking its claim over some part of the plain. The Abelisaurus freezes for a moment, one foot still in the air, then sets it down slowly and resumes doing, well, basically nothing. You can almost feel the unspoken attitude, not my problem. By midday, the activity around you begins to shift. The hadrosaurs start moving toward the shaded edges of the plain. The sauropods position themselves to block the sun with the tall trees. Even the smaller predators vanish into the ferns. Abelisaurus remains in the open a few moments longer, then turns, finally showing some initiative, and ambles toward a stand of trees. You follow it into the dappled shade, the sudden coolness a relief after the glare outside. Here, the air smells different, less of sun-baked vegetation, more of damp bark and crushed leaves. Insects click and buzz in the shadows, their sounds amplified by the quiet. Abelisaurus settles into a slow circuit between the trees, pausing to nudge at the base of a trunk, maybe searching for a scent or a mark left by another animal. It's a strange thing, moving through this world beside it. Everything else here has a visible job: graze, flee, hunt, hide. But Abelisaurus's job seems to be present. A looming figure that the ecosystem registers but doesn't necessarily expect fireworks from. By the time it emerges from the far side of the grove, the plain has gone still. The only real movement is the ripple of heat and the occasional flicker of wings from a prehistoric insect. The neighbors have all retreated, and in their absence, Abelisaurus keeps walking, slow and steady, as though this gentle dominion is exactly enough. The stand of trees thins again, and what opens up ahead is a patchwork of scrubby plants, low shrubs, and bare dirt, the kind of place where every sound travels just a little too far. Abelisaurus pauses at the edge, and for once, you think you see something resembling focus in its posture. Its head lifts slightly higher, turning from side to side in measured arcs. That's when you notice it, the skull. From here, with the sunlight cutting across it, you can really see the unusual proportions. It's shorter front to back than you'd expect for a predator of this size, yet deeper vertically, like someone pressed down on it from above and the bone bulged upward in protest. The eye sockets are positioned in a way that gives it a mild, almost curious expression, an accidental byproduct of its design. Mainstream fact: paleontologists believe Abelisaurus's skull shape was well suited for delivering powerful, bone-crunching bites, with its jaws acting less like scissors and more like blunt force weapons. This wasn't a delicate flesh slicer, it was a creature designed to grip and hold, letting sheer force do the work. And yet, right now, it's using that same head to simply stare at a bush. You step closer, careful not to crunch too loudly on the dried leaves underfoot. The bush rustles. A small prehistoric mammal, no bigger than a rabbit, darts out, freezing in the open for just a moment before bolting into another thicket. You brace for the strike. Abelisaurus blinks. Then it turns away. You're starting to suspect its predatory career was less savage terror and more polite disinterest. Historians still argue whether Abelisaurus was an active apex predator or a habitual scavenger, especially given how incomplete its fossil record is. Without more skeletal remains, it's hard to know exactly how the rest of its body balanced out, how much muscle it carried, how much speed it could muster when it actually tried. One fringe idea suggests it might have relied on sudden ambushes from short cover, similar to how some big cats hunt, but with far less finesse. Its head dips now, not toward prey, but toward the ground. It nudges something with the tip of its snout, a bleached, half-buried bone. Judging from the size, it's likely from some mid-sized herbivore, maybe a juvenile that didn't make it through last season. Abelisaurus paws at the dirt with one foot, exposing more of it, then lowers its head again as if sniffing. You half expect it to start gnawing, but it just stares for a long moment before moving on. There's a strange rhythm to its attention span. A flicker of focus, followed by complete disengagement. You skirt around its left side now, noticing details you hadn't seen before. The faint pattern of mottling along its flanks, the way its skin seems thicker and slightly wrinkled near the joints, almost like leather left out in the sun too long. Its arms are indeed small, ending in two stubby fingers, and you can't imagine them doing much of anything useful beyond maybe holding onto a particularly cooperative sandwich. The scrubland stretches ahead in broken patches. In the distance, a couple of small predatory dinosaurs are working together, darting in and out of cover in pursuit of something you can't see from here. There's energy in their movements, a sense of immediacy that Abelisaurus lacks entirely. Quirky tidbit: some paleontologists have half-joked that Abelisaurus's short arms weren't just useless, they may have been counterproductive for certain behaviors, forcing it to rely almost entirely on its mouth for any interaction with the world. Imagine trying to live your life without ever being able to scratch your own face, and you get the idea. The sun's angle is shifting now, throwing longer shadows across the ground. Abelisaurus ambles toward a cluster of rocks and low trees, possibly drawn by the shade. As you follow, you realize you've stopped expecting action. You're not here to witness an apex predator's greatest hits. You're here to watch the long, uneventful spaces between them. It steps onto the rocks, its weight causing one to shift with a muffled thud. It pauses, testing its footing, then lowers its head again, this time toward a trickle of water running between the stones. It drinks. Slowly. You settle nearby, resting against a warm boulder, listening to the faint, rhythmic sound of its swallowing. This is Abelisaurus in its element. Not charging, not fighting, but simply existing in a world that seems to demand constant energy from everything else. Somehow, its refusal to play by that rule feels almost admirable. The trickle of water fades behind you as Abelisaurus continues forward, slipping deeper into the mottled shadows of the taller trees. The air cools here, damp with the scent of moss and decomposing leaves. Shafts of sunlight pierce the canopy in thin, dusty beams, catching on floating particles that make the whole place feel like it's underwater. Abelisaurus slows, though you're not entirely sure it's possible for it to go slower, and then does something you haven't seen yet. It lowers itself to the ground. The movement is surprisingly quiet for something its size, just a low creak of muscle and bone as it folds its legs beneath its bulk. Once down, it stays there, perfectly still. You take a few cautious steps closer, watching for signs of alertness, but there aren't any. The head dips slightly, eyes half-lidded. Its breathing is slow and heavy, a steady expansion and collapse of its ribcage. Mainstream fact: most large theropods were likely opportunistic in their activity, resting during the hottest parts of the day to conserve energy. Historians still argue whether Abelisaurus followed this same rhythm out of necessity or simply because it could. Its territory may have been stable enough that it didn't need to be in constant motion like some of its hungrier relatives. You find a spot against a tree trunk, just far enough to be safe if it startles awake. The forest hums around you, small creatures rustling in the leaf litter, the occasional chirp from some bird-like ancestor in the branches. You half expect a sudden, sharp sound to snap Abelisaurus back into action, but nothing does. The fringe theory here, and it's one that's gotten a chuckle or two among paleontologists, is that certain large predators might have been borderline narcoleptic during the day. Not in the medical sense, but in the luxury predator sense. If you're big enough and scary-looking enough, you can afford to nap whenever you feel like it, because who's going to bother you? Its head lowers further now, chin almost brushing the leaf litter. One eyelid closes completely, the other lagging behind, giving it a slightly lopsided, drowsy look. You watch a small beetle crawl along its forearm, undisturbed. Somewhere nearby, a branch cracks, not from anything huge, probably just a small animal, but Abelisaurus doesn't even twitch. Minutes pass, maybe more. Time here feels different without any real action to anchor it. The only change is the slow drift of sunlight across the ground as the day ages. You let your own breathing fall into sync with its, feeling the rhythm press into you like a tide. At one point, a curious little ornithopod, about the size of a modern turkey, edges into the clearing. It freezes when it spots the predator, but Abelisaurus doesn't react. The smaller dinosaur hesitates, then begins nibbling at some low ferns, always keeping one eye fixed on the sleeping giant. You half wonder if it's realized it could probably walk right up and peck Abelisaurus on the nose without consequence. Quirky fact: even in fossil form, scientists can sometimes tell when an animal had long periods of inactivity based on bone growth patterns. Certain microscopic lines in the bone tissue can hint at cycles of stress and rest. Of course, with Abelisaurus, there's not enough skeletal evidence to prove such patterns existed for it specifically, but looking at this scene, you'd be tempted to assume so. A fly lands on its nostril. The nostril twitches once, just enough to send the insect buzzing away. That's the most movement you've seen in half an hour. Eventually, the light shifts in such a way that it catches Abelisaurus's half-open eye. The pupil contracts slightly. It lifts its head, not all the way, just enough to take a slow look around. Then, with a low groan of effort, it gets back onto its feet. The motion is unhurried, like someone deciding the nap is over not because they want it to be, but because lying there any longer might make getting up too much trouble later. It takes 3 steps, then stops again, sniffing the air. You stand, brushing bits of bark and moss from your clothes. The nap might be over, but you're not expecting a sudden burst of activity. If anything, the whole thing feels like a warm-up stretch for more walking. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. Abelisaurus drifts onward, deeper into the forest, each step breaking twigs that snap with sharp little pops in the stillness. You follow, the air around you thickening again as the canopy closes in, your mind still carrying the heavy, unhurried pace of that midday rest. The trees ahead thin just enough to let the light in, and with it comes a subtle shift in the air, warmer, drier, and tinged with a faint mineral scent. Abelisaurus slows, nostrils flaring, and you realize it's heading toward an exposed ridge of rock that juts out from the forest floor like the spine of some long-buried beast. You climb after it, your boots scraping over the rough surface. The view opens up here, revealing a gentle slope leading down into a shallow basin. At the far side, there's a scatter of pale shapes half buried in the dirt, bones. Mainstream fact: the fossil remains of Abelisaurus itself were first uncovered in 1983 in Patagonia, in what had once been a floodplain. Only the skull was found, meaning everything we think we know about the rest of its body has been reconstructed from its relatives. Even now, decades later, paleontologists still argue whether the missing pieces would have made it more elegant or more ungainly than its cousins. Down in the basin, Abelisaurus wanders among the bones, lowering its head to sniff one here and there. You spot ribs, vertebrae, and what might be part of a pelvis, though time and weather have blurred their edges into soft, rounded forms. The scene has that same quiet weight you feel when walking through a modern archaeological site, where the past is both right in front of you and impossibly far away. A quirky tidbit for you: there's a fringe theory that some predators, unable to secure fresh kills regularly, may have lingered near old carcasses long after the flesh was gone, perhaps gnawing for minerals or simply out of habit. Watching Abelisaurus now, you could almost believe it. It picks at one long bone, jaw shifting slightly as if testing its hardness, before letting it drop with a dull clack onto the dirt. You crouch at the edge of the slope, resting your hands on the warm stone. From here, you can see faint marks on the bones themselves, scratches, grooves, some deep, others barely visible. They might be the work of other predators, or they could be the remnants of ancient scavengers the size of rats, long gone now. Historians still debate how much of the fossil record is shaped by the behavior of big predators like Abelisaurus versus the smaller cleanup crews that followed in their wake. Abelisaurus steps around a vertebra nearly the size of your torso, tail swaying with slow balance. There's no rush in its movements, no scavenger's urgency to strip what's left, no nervous glances for competition. It's as if the bones are more like waypoints in its wandering, markers in a mental map it's been walking for years. The wind picks up slightly, carrying the dry scent of the exposed earth. You notice the difference in sound here: less insect hum, more of a hollow quiet that settles in wide, open places. Abelisaurus lifts its head, scanning the horizon, not with sharp intensity but with the vague curiosity of something checking if the scenery's changed. Your mind drifts to the paleontologists who found the original Abelisaurus skull. Imagine that, digging through layers of sediment until a curve of bone emerges, knowing it belonged to something that walked right where you're standing. That skull, missing its lower jaw, still had enough distinctive features to place it within the Abelisauridae family. Yet everything else, the body, the habits, the daily life, had to be guessed. Standing here now, watching it pick its way among the bones, you can't help but think the guesses probably missed a lot of this stillness. Abelisaurus pauses over one last bone, this one half hidden under a drift of loose dirt. It noses at it, shifts a bit of soil away, and then leaves it be. Without a sound, it turns from the basin and begins to make its way back up toward the ridge. You follow, feeling the heat radiate from the rock under your feet. From the ridge, the forest looms ahead again, the shadowed paths swallowing the bright edges of the afternoon. Abelisaurus steps into that darkness without hesitation, and you slip in after it, the memory of sun-bleached bones lingering like an afterimage in your mind. The light fades quickly once you're back under the canopy. The forest here feels older somehow, taller trees with thick, gnarled trunks and deep grooves in their bark. Every so often, the breeze threads its way through the branches, loosening a faint shower of leaves and pollen that spirals lazily to the forest floor. Abelisaurus moves ahead, its massive feet muffling the crackle of twigs and dry foliage with each step. Then, without warning, it stops. Its head tilts slightly, nostrils flaring, and you hear it, a low, almost apologetic sound that escapes from deep in its throat. Not the commanding roar you might expect from a 25-foot predator, more like a sigh that's been given the faintest edge of a growl. Mainstream fact: most reconstructions of Abelisaurus are completely silent because we don't know exactly what noises it made. But it's plausible it had vocal sacs or resonating chambers in its skull like some modern birds and reptiles, producing sounds to communicate with others over distance. Historians still argue whether these noises were primarily for intimidation, territory marking, or something more social. The sound hangs in the air for a moment, then fades, absorbed by the forest. Nothing answers back. Abelisaurus stands still for a few seconds longer, perhaps waiting for a reply that doesn't come, before starting forward again at the same unhurried pace. You trail after it, curious. That small noise didn't seem like a serious hunting call or a warning. It felt more like it was checking if anyone else was out there. A fringe theory once suggested that certain theropods, including Abelisaurids, may have had such quiet, low-frequency calls that they could pass under the notice of prey but still reach other predators over long distances. Imagine a conversation happening entirely below the threshold of human hearing. Whispers you can't hear, but can still feel in your bones. As you walk, the undergrowth thickens, forcing you to duck around low branches and sidestep the occasional mass of thorny plants. Abelisaurus doesn't seem to mind, pushing through with a slow persistence that bends the foliage without much resistance. Every so often, it makes another sound, sometimes just a single soft rumble, sometimes a brief sequence that rises and falls like it's tuning an instrument. In one patch of dappled light, you spot something small and feathered darting between roots. It freezes when Abelisaurus passes, its head tilting to one side as if listening. Then it vanishes again into the shadows. You can't tell if it's reacting to the predator's presence or its voice. Here's your quirky detail for the section. In some bird species today, quiet or even incomplete calls can serve as a kind of "are you there?" between individuals, like a prehistoric equivalent of sending a short, punctuation-free text message. Maybe that's all Abelisaurus is doing right now, throwing little sound pulses into the world just to see if anything bounces back. The forest begins to thin again, not into open plains this time, but into a marshy stretch where the air is heavy and warm. Patches of standing water reflect the canopy in fractured, rippling images. The scent of damp plants mixes with something faintly metallic, and you notice Abelisaurus raising its head higher as it walks, tasting the air. It makes another sound here, slightly louder, a low, resonant hum that you feel in your ribs more than you hear with your ears. The surface of the nearby water trembles faintly from the vibration. Still, there's no answer. If it's calling for something, whatever it is either isn't nearby or doesn't care to respond. Eventually, it stops vocalizing altogether and focuses instead on weaving between the pools of water, its tail swinging just above the surface. You follow on the driest patches you can find, the mud tugging at your boots. By the time you've crossed the marsh, the light has shifted again, leaning toward the softer tones of late afternoon. Abelisaurus keeps moving, silent now, as though the earlier calls were just a momentary experiment in communication. The forest closes in around you again, and the air cools with the promise of evening. The forest begins to slope upward gradually, the ground underfoot firmer now, composed of packed earth and scattered stones. Abelisaurus moves steadily, each step deliberate, almost meditative. The occasional bird-like cry echoes off the trees, but you quickly realize these are nothing compared to the ambient hum of insects and the distant rustle of small herbivores hiding from view. You start to notice patterns in its behavior. Each so-called pause isn't really a pause. It's a measured adjustment of stance, a tilt of the head, a brief survey of its surroundings. It's not hunting, not interacting, not actively doing anything that screams predator. Yet everything it does has the subtle purpose of conserving energy, staying aware, and maintaining its presence in the environment. Mainstream fact: Abelisaurus, like its abelisaurid cousins, had a compact body with robust legs, which may have made it a surprisingly efficient walker. Historians still argue whether its body shape allowed it to sprint short distances effectively or whether it was mostly adapted for steady, long-range travel. The sun filters through the trees in thin slants, creating a mottled pattern of light and shadow across its hide. You catch glimpses of subtle coloration, sandy browns, muted ochres, and patches that almost resemble dried leaves stuck to its body. There's a natural camouflage here that might have helped it approach potential prey, or simply avoid unnecessary confrontations. A fringe theory comes to mind. Some paleontologists have speculated that Abelisaurids may have used subtle body displays to communicate without vocalizing, flicking a tail, tilting a head, or shifting weight slightly. Today, it seems entirely plausible. Abelisaurus adjusts its posture now and then, small motions almost invisible unless you're paying very close attention. You step carefully over a tangle of roots, and the sound of your footfall causes a tiny flock of early bird relatives to erupt from the undergrowth. They flit overhead in a scattered cloud, chirping nervously before vanishing into the distant canopy. Abelisaurus barely registers them, lowering its head briefly before resuming its slow progression up the slope. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some researchers have mused that Abelisaurus might have spent much of its day simply walking, patrolling territory, checking for intruders, or scouting for food, without ever engaging in an active hunt. Watching it now, you begin to understand how this could be true. Its life is a series of motions punctuated by brief moments of observation, as if the act of moving itself was the purpose. As you reach a small rise, the forest opens slightly, revealing a distant ridge capped with low trees and rocky outcroppings. Abelisaurus heads in that direction, pacing steadily along a faint game trail worn into the soil. You follow, noting the contrast between the small, nervous creatures darting in the underbrush and this massive, unhurried presence that dominates the landscape merely by existing. The wind shifts here, carrying a faint tang of water and wet vegetation from a nearby stream. Abelisaurus pauses briefly, nostrils flaring as though cataloging the scents. Then, without urgency, it continues forward. There's no hunting, no confrontation, just the slow, methodical navigation of its territory. A creature completely comfortable in its environment, confident enough not to exert itself unnecessarily. Minutes stretch into a rhythm. Step, sniff, glance, adjust. Watching it, you realize how strangely soothing it is to follow. There's no chaos, no adrenaline, just steady, calm presence. And somehow, in the middle of this prehistoric forest, you begin to feel at home. By the time the ridge comes into view, the light is softer, leaning toward evening, and the forest's noise begins to wane. Abelisaurus continues its gentle march, a slow sentinel moving through the green and shadow, leaving impressions in the earth that will last long after the sun sets. You crest the ridge alongside Abelisaurus, the forest thinning gradually to reveal a panoramic view of rolling hills and scattered trees stretching toward the horizon. The light is golden now, late afternoon filtering through high branches, casting long, soft shadows across the uneven ground. Every detail seems sharper here. The texture of bark, the shimmer of small insects in the sunlight, the faint ripples of a distant stream catching light like silver threads. Abelisaurus moves with the same deliberate rhythm, its head raised slightly as if surveying the landscape. You notice how little it cares about the expansive view or any potential drama it could be witnessing. For most creatures, this might be a moment to spot prey or spot danger. For Abelisaurus, it's simply another step, another part of its slow passage through the world. Mainstream fact: Abelisaurus was likely among the top carnivores in its ecosystem during the Late Cretaceous of South America. Its skull structure and body size suggest that, theoretically, it could dominate many of the other predators around. Historians still argue whether this dominance was actualized through hunting skill or simply presence and intimidation. A quirky detail emerges as you watch. One of the smaller dinosaurs in the valley, a nimble little ornithopod, pauses at the edge of the foliage, eyeing Abelisaurus with obvious caution. It twitches its head nervously before retreating, leaving a tiny imprint in the soft soil. This little scene plays out like a slow-motion dance, predator and prey existing in the same space with minimal interaction. You step carefully along the ridge, the ground uneven underfoot. A small rock dislodges, rolling downhill with a muted clatter. Abelisaurus doesn't react. You pause, realizing that it has learned the rhythm of this environment, the small noises and vibrations that might unsettle other animals. For it, the world is predictable, navigable without drama. Fringe theories in paleontology suggest that some large theropods may have exhibited surprisingly low-energy lifestyles, moving through their habitats slowly and conserving energy whenever possible. Watching Abelisaurus now, following the gentle sway of its tail and the measured placement of its feet, you start to believe it. There's a kind of quiet mastery in its motions, a refusal to waste effort where none is needed. The ridge begins to slope downward into a small valley dotted with ferns and cycads. Abelisaurus turns and starts its descent with the same patient cadence, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of loose stones and roots beneath its weight. You trail along behind, noting how it tests footing with each step, adjusting subtly to maintain balance over uneven terrain. The valley is surprisingly quiet. Even the usual background hum of insects seems to retreat in reverence, or perhaps in response to the shadow of a 25-foot predator moving through it without aggression. You notice the occasional splash in a shallow pool, a small amphibian or fish disturbed by your presence or the dinosaur's movement. Abelisaurus doesn't care. Its attention remains soft, cursory, almost meditative. Mainstream fact check. Fossils suggest that Abelisaurus's forelimbs were extremely reduced, which may have limited its hunting style compared to other large predators. Historians still argue whether this meant it relied more on scavenging than active predation, or if its head and jaws compensated for the lack of arm utility. You take a deep breath of the humid air, letting the scent of wet earth and vegetation fill your lungs. Abelisaurus pauses in the valley, nose lowered briefly to the ground, then lifts its head and glances at the far side where a cluster of low trees stands. The movement is subtle but deliberate, a navigation through its world, paced in ways that feel almost absurdly calm compared to the chaos you might expect in a predator's life. You follow, letting your steps synchronize with its steady rhythm, absorbing the quiet, the gentle sway of leaves overhead, the muted trickle of water in the valley below. Time stretches, the passage of moments marked only by the soft, steady footsteps of the dinosaur leading the way. The valley opens into a narrow corridor flanked by taller trees and dense undergrowth. Sunlight filters through in scattered beams, painting the leaf-strewn ground with shifting patches of gold. Abelisaurus moves at its unhurried pace, each step deliberate, feet sinking slightly into the soft earth, leaving deep, three-toed impressions. You follow, careful not to disturb the quiet rhythm it sets. Here, the forest is alive in subtle ways. Tiny insects scuttle across the ground, birds dart between branches, and small mammals, some no larger than a modern rat, peek out from behind ferns, twitching nervously at any sign of motion. Abelisaurus doesn't react. Its presence alone seems to communicate authority without exerting it, a living shadow that everything else acknowledges with a mixture of respect and avoidance. Mainstream fact: Abelisaurus's legs were strong and muscular, suggesting it could traverse large distances efficiently. Historians still argue whether its size and structure allowed for short bursts of speed during hunting or if it primarily relied on a slow, energy-conserving patrol style. Watching it move now, you get the impression it's the latter. You notice a faint trail of crushed plants beneath its feet, evidence of its path, a slow disruption of the forest floor that marks its passage without urgency. There's a pattern to its wandering, almost like it's checking invisible boundaries or revisiting favored spots. The movements are rhythmic and oddly comforting. A fringe theory suggests that some large theropods may have marked their territories not through aggressive confrontation but through habitual travel along the same routes, leaving sense and visual cues to signal their presence. Abelisaurus doesn't appear concerned with dominance displays, yet its routine seems to communicate ownership without a single roar or fight. Ahead, a small stream curves through the corridor. The water glints in the fading light, moving lazily over smooth stones. Abelisaurus lowers its head, testing the edge with a slow inhale of air and a subtle dip toward the water. It drinks, careful and measured, not splashing or alarming any nearby creatures. You kneel nearby, watching, and feel a quiet sense of awe. It's a moment that should feel charged, predator and environment in tension, yet there's only calm. Quirky detail. Some paleontologists have speculated that Abelisaurus may have spent significant portions of its day in low-energy activities like drinking, walking, and scanning its surroundings rather than hunting. The lack of high-action scenes in its life might explain why fossil evidence of kills is scarce. Observing it now, the idea suddenly seems quite reasonable. After drinking, Abelisaurus lifts its massive head, shakes it once, and continues along the bank. The forest around the stream is lush, damp, and scented with wet leaves and rich soil. Even the small birds and mammals seem to relax slightly, adjusting to its predictable presence rather than fleeing in panic. You follow, stepping carefully over roots and small branches, noting the precision of its movements. Every so often, it pauses, one foot slightly lifted, nose twitching, as if cataloging everything around it without any intention of immediate action. This is the pace of Abelisaurus, not a predator in pursuit, but a ruler of its quiet domain, moving with patience and subtle authority. By the time you reach the end of the corridor, the sun has dipped lower, casting long, dappled shadows across the stream. Abelisaurus steps out into a small clearing, and for a moment, it seems to pause just to appreciate, or maybe just to exist in, the space it dominates. You breathe deeply, the forest sounds stretching and softening around you, the rhythm of this enormous, slow-moving creature imprinting itself onto your own sense of time. The clearing Abelisaurus enters is small but notable, almost like a natural theater carved into the forest. Sunlight falls in golden pools, reflecting off a patch of still water at its center. You notice the gentle ripples caused by insects skimming the surface, and a faint rustle in the reeds lining the edges. Abelisaurus steps carefully through the scene, tail swaying, muscles rippling under its mottled hide. It stops at the edge of the water, nostrils flaring, sniffing the air. The movement is measured, deliberate, and strangely intimate. You almost feel like you're intruding on a private ritual. Mainstream fact: large theropods, including Abelisaurus, likely needed to drink frequently to maintain hydration and bodily functions, particularly during hot days. Historians still argue whether they approached water sources cautiously to avoid ambushes, or if their size made them largely unthreatened by potential predators. Abelisaurus kneels slightly, bringing its massive head closer to the water. Its reflection shimmers in the liquid, distorted by the faint ripples. You watch, captivated by how still and patient it is, the kind of patience that seems almost meditative. You think about how few creatures could survive without constant motion or vigilance, and how Abelisaurus has mastered stillness as a form of power. A fringe theory suggests that some large theropods may have engaged in what could be considered behavioral meditation, pausing to absorb their surroundings, conserve energy, or even regulate body temperature. Watching Abelisaurus now, the idea doesn't seem absurd. Its movements are so measured that it could almost be conducting a quiet inventory of its world. You notice small details you'd missed before: the subtle flick of its ears, the barely perceptible shifting of weight from one leg to another, the slight twitch of its jaw muscles as it tests the scent of the water. Quirky tidbit: one paleontologist jokingly suggested that Abelisaurus might have had a daydreaming mode, periods when it wandered aimlessly with no clear goal other than moving, smelling, and existing. Right now, it's easy to imagine that this is exactly what's happening. The surrounding forest responds to its presence in a muted symphony of sound. A branch creaks gently, a small bird trills cautiously, insects buzz and hum. Nothing challenges it, nothing provokes, and yet everything acknowledges the silent authority it projects. You start to notice that the longer you watch, the more you synchronize your own pace to its slow, unhurried rhythm. Abelisaurus eventually steps from the water's edge, shaking its massive head as droplets scatter in tiny arcs. Its eyes sweep the clearing, a calm vigilance that requires no rush. Then, with a casual yet commanding motion, it turns and begins to move toward the far side of the clearing where denser trees await. You follow, careful to stay in the soft shadows, noting how the forest transitions from bright, reflective light to filtered, dappled green. The undergrowth thickens slightly, but Abelisaurus navigates without effort. Its tail brushes the lower branches, bending foliage gently as it passes. You catch a whiff of the earthy scent of wet leaves and moss, mingling with the faint aroma of its leathery hide. There's a slow, almost hypnotic cadence to this movement. Step, pause, sniff, adjust. The creature is alive yet unhurried, present yet absent from conventional expectations of predatory drama. By the time the clearing recedes behind you, the golden light has softened into the warmer amber tones of late afternoon. Shadows stretch longer, the forest quiets slightly, and Abelisaurus continues on its path with the kind of patient, steady assurance that suggests it has been moving this way for millennia. You can't help but marvel at the simplicity and complexity coexisting in its slow, deliberate wandering. The forest begins to slope upward once more, the terrain uneven but manageable. Abelisaurus moves steadily, each footfall creating a soft impression in the damp earth. You notice subtle details along the way, the delicate shimmer of moss on rocks, the faint scent of sap rising from trees, the occasional rustle of small animals hiding in the undergrowth. Everything seems aware of Abelisaurus, yet nothing panics. It is both presence and absence simultaneously. You follow in quiet fascination. Its pace is slow, deliberate, like someone taking a morning stroll with no pressing errands, only the world to absorb. Mainstream fact, Abelisaurus, despite being a large theropod, was likely not built for long, high-speed pursuits. Its skeletal structure suggests it favored walking or short bursts of speed when necessary. Historians still argue whether it actively hunted or scavenged more frequently, given its reduced forelimbs and massive head. The slope gives way to a small plateau dotted with ferns and cycads. Abelisaurus pauses, nose twitching, ears attuned to the subtle sounds of the forest. It's remarkable how little movement it requires to survey its surroundings. A small flock of early bird relatives flutters nearby, observing cautiously before disappearing into the canopy. You realize that Abelisaurus has mastered an energy-efficient existence, one where awareness is constant but exertion is minimal. A quirky detail, some researchers suggest that Abelisaurus may have had periods of near inactivity during the day, punctuated only by brief, purposeful movements. Watching it now, this theory feels plausible. Its steps are precise, each one measured, conserving energy while maintaining awareness of its environment. You notice faint markings on the trunks of some trees, a curious pattern of scratches. Abelisaurus steps carefully past them, nose dipping slightly. Fringe theory, these markings might have been incidental, perhaps caused by territorial displays, or maybe they were the result of random contact during daily activity. Historians still debate their purpose. The plateau opens into a gentle slope leading to a distant rise. Abelisaurus begins the ascent, tail swaying with subtle balance. The sun has shifted further west, the light warming the undergrowth in amber tones. You can hear the faint trickle of a stream far below, carrying the scent of wet stone and plant matter up to you. A small herd of herbivorous dinosaurs grazes near the base of the rise. Abelisaurus notices them but doesn't hurry or chase. It's a predator, yes, but not one consumed by urgency. It moves past, perhaps acknowledging their presence without confrontation. There's a strange grace in this restraint, an energy-conscious approach to life in the Late Cretaceous. You continue behind, following the rhythm. Step after step, the forest seems to breathe with Abelisaurus, every rustle and whisper syncing with its deliberate pace. It is a creature of presence, quiet authority, and minimal exertion. A paradox of predation without frenzy, existence without chaos. By the time the rise is nearly beneath you, the light has softened further. Shadows stretch long, and the forest quiets to a gentle hum. Abelisaurus pauses briefly, nostrils flaring, then continues onward, a slow, steady sentinel guiding you through a prehistoric world that demands little of him, yet commands absolute attention. The slope narrows as you follow Abelisaurus, forming a natural corridor of dense trees and tangled roots. The filtered light here has taken on a warm, amber glow, spilling across leaves and stones, accentuating textures that were barely noticeable before. You notice the subtle movement of shadows, the way the wind rustles leaves in a soft, staccato rhythm. Abelisaurus continues at its steady, deliberate pace, tail swaying just enough to balance its massive frame. Mainstream fact: Abelisaurus's reduced forelimbs were likely compensated by a strong neck and powerful jaws, allowing it to manipulate objects or strike prey with precision despite short arms. Historians still argue whether this anatomical arrangement made it an ambush predator or primarily a scavenger, given the lack of complete fossil evidence. The forest around you is quiet but alive. Tiny creatures, lizards, insects, early mammals, peek from hiding, observing the giant without alarm. Abelisaurus doesn't chase, doesn't react. Its presence alone seems to organize the energy of the space around it. There's an understated authority in this, a calm dominance that doesn't need to be expressed violently. A quirky tidbit: paleontologists have suggested that some large theropods might have used subtle environmental cues, like the placement of their feet or tail sways, as nonverbal communication with conspecifics or rivals. Watching Abelisaurus now, you notice these small, almost imperceptible gestures: the faint lift of a foot, a gentle tail flick, as if it's marking territory without confrontation. The path widens briefly, revealing a low ridge covered with moss and scattered stones. Abelisaurus pauses here, nose dipping slightly, sniffing the faint scent of other creatures that have passed this way. Fringe theory: some researchers believe Abelisaurus may have relied heavily on scent marking and olfactory information to navigate its world rather than chasing prey actively. Historians still debate the significance of these behaviors in Abelisaurid ecology. You notice a small cluster of bones half buried under leaves and dirt. Abelisaurus approaches them, snout hovering for a moment. It nudges a rib gently, then steps away, uninterested. There's no urgency, no display of dominance, just measured inspection, an acknowledgement of the environment without altering it. The corridor narrows again, winding into a patch of ferns and cycads. Light dances across Abelisaurus's hide, highlighting subtle textures: the mottled skin, faint ridges along its back, the supple sag of muscles under thick flesh. Each movement is precise yet unhurried, a study in energy conservation and controlled presence. You follow closely, sensing a rhythm that matches your own heartbeat. Step after step, the forest hums with quiet life. Insects buzzing, distant birds calling softly, leaves swaying in response to the breeze. Abelisaurus pauses briefly to sniff the air, nostrils flaring, then continues, guiding you through the green labyrinth of trees with gentle, unwavering authority. By the time the corridor opens into another clearing, the forest light has shifted again, leaning toward dusk. Shadows stretch long, and the ambient sounds grow muted. Abelisaurus pauses at the edge of the clearing, tail flicking slightly, scanning the area. You take a moment to inhale the scent of damp earth and fading sunlight, letting the slow, deliberate cadence of this ancient predator settle into your own awareness. The clearing is wider than the previous ones, almost like a natural amphitheater carved by time and water. Soft shafts of evening light pour through breaks in the canopy, illuminating patches of ferns and moss that blanket the uneven ground. Abelisaurus moves forward slowly, each step careful and deliberate, feet sinking slightly into the soft soil. You follow, matching its unhurried rhythm, feeling the tension of the day ease from your shoulders. Mainstream fact: Abelisaurus lived during the Late Cretaceous in what is now Patagonia, and its environment would have included floodplains, forests, and seasonal waterways. Historians still argue how much its behavior was influenced by these landscapes, whether it roamed widely or remained near familiar hunting grounds. Abelisaurus pauses mid-clearing, nostrils flaring as it scents the air. A faint rustle of leaves betrays the presence of a small, feathered dinosaur scurrying across the forest floor. It freezes, eyeing the predator, then disappears without a trace. Abelisaurus watches for a moment, uninterested in giving chase. Its attention is selective, conserving energy while maintaining awareness of its surroundings. A quirky tidbit: some paleontologists have proposed that large abelisaurids like Abelisaurus may have had very low-energy hunting patterns, spending much of their time walking, observing, and interacting minimally with other creatures unless absolutely necessary. Watching it now, this seems entirely plausible. The clearing opens onto a gentle slope that leads toward a denser section of forest. Abelisaurus begins to move in that direction, slow and deliberate, each step breaking twigs and rustling leaves with soft, natural sounds. Fringe theory. It suggested that Abelisaurus may have navigated its territory using a combination of scent, visual cues, and habitual paths rather than active pursuit or predation. Historians still debate the role of such behavior in predator ecology. You notice how it pauses occasionally, adjusting its posture, raising and lowering its head, almost as if cataloging the environment. Its tail swings softly, brushing against low ferns, leaving a subtle trace of passage. You sense the power in these measured movements. A predator that doesn't need to rush, that dominates its world quietly through presence and patience. As the sun dips lower, the forest softens into gentle shadows. Abelisaurus continues onward, disappearing gradually into the denser trees. The rhythm of its steps, the gentle sway of tail and body, begins to imprint itself on your own breathing, slowing your pulse, inviting a deep calm. You follow a short distance, then pause. The light fades into a warm dusk, the forest quiets, and the final impression of Abelisaurus lingers. A presence that is commanding yet gentle, a life moving slowly yet purposefully. You take a deep breath, the sounds of leaves, distant water, and insects surrounding you like a soft lullaby. It's here, in this quiet moment, that the story of Abelisaurus, so slow, unhurried, and almost mundane, feels both immense and intimate. Its world continues around you, vast and patient, as you stand still, absorbing the gentle rhythm of prehistoric life. The forest breathes around you, settling into a quiet rhythm as evening deepens. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every distant ripple of water blends into a soft, continuous hum that carries you gently towards stillness. The heavy presence of Abelisaurus has passed, yet its slow, deliberate movements linger in your awareness, a pulse that matches your own gradually slowing heartbeat. Soft shadows stretch across the forest floor, merging with the fading light to create a mosaic of gentle tones. Insects hum faintly, birds call quietly from distant branches, and the wind whispers through the trees with a delicate, almost musical cadence. You notice the texture of the ground beneath your feet, the subtle scent of earth and leaves, the faint touch of cool air on your skin. The world feels calm, expansive, and infinitely patient. Let the imagery settle in. Imagine Abelisaurus wandering through this forest, steps slow and purposeful, entirely attuned to its surroundings, yet completely unhurried. Its presence doesn't demand attention, it invites it gently, softly. Every movement is measured, almost meditative, and you can carry that sense with you as the day's tension falls away. Feel the quiet seep into your own body. Relax your shoulders, soften your breathing, let your eyes close if they wish. The forest, the gentle rhythms, the slow march of an ancient predator, all fold together into a calming lullaby. Let your mind drift through this timeless space, where life moves without hurry, without panic, in perfect balance with itself. Soon, the shadows deepen, the last light of day fades, and the forest, Abelisaurus, and your own awareness merge into a single, gentle moment of rest. You're safe, you're still, and the rhythm of prehistoric calm carries you onward.